Hi, I'm Lynn Richards, and I want to welcome you to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with CNU thought leaders. I felt it was important that we create a platform for members to engage, discuss, and really brainstorm around issues with the current public health crisis and the corresponding economic downturn in real time. This week, we're going to be hearing from four longtime CNU members and friends about lessons from the last recession. Whether or not we're going into a recession now, I think, or how long it will last, I think we are in a recession, and how long it will last remains to be seen. But we're going to hear from Kevin Klinkenberg, Joe Minicozzi, Frank Starkey, and Mary Madden, four new urbanists who weathered the 2008 recession and came out on the other side of it. They're here to tell you about what they did, how they did it, strategies. Every recession is different, but I think that the inventiveness and the stick-to-itiveness is important regardless of the conditions around the recession. So today we're going to hear from Kevin Klinkenberg, who's currently the executive director of Midtown Kansas City Now, which is a community development organization for Kansas City. I call him a jack of all trades. He's an urban designer, architect, planning, zoning wonk, redeveloper, wannabe musician, and all-around great guy. I should also mention he was the co-chair of CNU 26 in Savannah. Frank Starkey, member of the CNU National Board, is a real estate developer with deep experience in developing pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods. Frank, too, is just a real salt of the earth, awesome person. Mary Madden has nearly 30 years experience in urban planning and design, community development, and historic preservation. She also worked for a chunk of time under the Obama administration with HUD. Mary, if any of you have checked in on the Project for Code Reform, Mary is one of the founding faculty members, and I'm always in awe of her insights and inspiration. Finally, Joe Minicozzi is an urban planner who imagines new ways to think about and visualize land use, urban design, and economics. I first heard about Joe's work in the early aughts from a mutual friend of ours, Lee Sobel, and Joe's been on message ever since. He's an amazing thinker. I am so absolutely pleased. Oh, I forgot to do this. I'm so absolutely pleased to be welcoming all four of these amazing new urbanists to this conversation today. So with that, Kevin, I'm going to turn this over to you for you to offer your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Am I live?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. It's still morning here on Central Standard Time. And Lynn, I've actually, I got a little timing myself here so that I don't drone on too long. I think this is a great topic. I've been looking forward to having this conversation even before this pandemic happened, because I think it would be useful for a lot of our younger members, especially. I'm certainly an optimist by nature, and I tend to look on the bright side of things, but I do think we're headed for a difficult recession, especially in the planning and real estate world. And perhaps we can talk more about that as a group later on, and the different perspectives, how we all see the next year or two. But what I really wanted to do was take a little time and share more of a personal story of the last recession, the Great Recession, as we call it, in the hopes that it can maybe help some people out as both a cautionary tale and hopefully something that is more hopeful on the backside. So I'm going to share a little bit of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I hope this is not too much of a Debbie Downer. The good news is we have Joe wrapping up at the end, so he's always going to brighten our day with something really charming and funny. So if this gets too negative, I apologize. I don't think it will be, but you know, when I think back to the Great Recession, it was really, it's not an academic thing for me. It was very, very personal. At the time, I was running a firm called 180 Urban Design and Architecture, And we had started in 2000 and really had a great run in a lot of ways. Had a really good, stable, growing business. A great team of people that I absolutely loved, and was extraordinarily proud of the work that we did. And like a lot of people who are probably in this fold of the CNU fold, I was a bit of a live to work kind of person. And when the recession came, when the financial crisis came, and business just evaporated, within the course of a year, basically almost all the book of work that we had was gone, and we were faced with a really, really difficult decision, and we had to make a decision to actually close the company and find something else to do. Now, we did that in many ways because we put ourselves in a financially fragile position, admittedly. And while uh, I think part of the conversation here today is how can people make themselves more financially resilient to deal with the ups and downs of economic cycles. Um, it was a real challenge for us, and because we weren't disciplined enough about focusing on profit as a company, we were a little lackadaisical in some of the oversight we had to making sure that we had reserves heading into hard times. When the hard times came, we couldn't handle it, even though we had a really smart, talented group of people, and as a result, it hit us all very, very hard. And as the kind of person who was very much wrapped up in the work and the passion of everything I was doing, that didn't hit just financially hard, hit very psychologically hard. And it was something that really, it shook me for a long time. Um, I was actually pretty good about dealing with the personal side of things in terms of my own finances and all that, but how it affected our business side was a real problem. And I think one of the lessons that I really took away from all that was to be much more sensitive to understanding how to, in business, whether you're in a private corporation, whether you're in public sector or a not-for-profit, that financial discipline is really important. And making money, having positive cash flow is really important. And in the good times, you have to do that. The time to start planning for financial resilience is not in a crisis. It's actually in the good times. And if you don't do that, then you're gonna put yourself in a bad place to begin with, because economic turbulence is not a bug of life; it's a feature. Um, I think in my lifetime we've had at least 5 drops in the Dow Jones of at least 40%, and that every cause of that is different, but it happens, and it's part of the nature of life. It's also part of the nature of life, though, that humans are incredibly resilient, and um, and I think we all understand that most of us get up every day trying to make the world better and to try to do something positive and accomplish something. And the result of that is why, over the long term, it's always good to bet on the resilience of humans and the fact that whenever you hit dark days, there are brighter days ahead. And so, in my own specific case, what I was able to do was find a way to come out of what was a pretty difficult time for me personally and even psychologically, and kind of dealing with the loss of the business, and rebound and find a new path for myself. Um, and so I think that's a message that I want to give to anybody: is we're all adaptable. We all can find a way. If for some reason over the course of the next year or two that your job, your career gets completely upended, there are ways to actually adapt and move on and be incredibly happy and still retain the passion for what you do. I think especially in this community of new urbanists, you generally find a lot of people who are very, very bright and who are interested in a lot of things and who are capable of doing great work in many different areas. In my particular world, I never would have imagined getting away from architecture as a profession, but I did, and I've ended up in a place running sort of community-oriented, not-for-profit or quasi-governmental agency before that, that I found that I'm actually really good at and really enjoy. And there are lots of ways that we can all, take that passion we have and deliver it in a really profound way in our own communities. So I always encourage people to say, even if your career path may be unusual or atypical, that doesn't mean there aren't ways to really have a true positive impact on your community. It might be as a side hustle, it might be as a hobby, it might be as an elected official or an appointed commissioner of some kind, but there are endless ways to have a great impact if your own economic situation is completely upended. And I would just lastly say, well, two quick things. One of this was why I wanted to write a manual for the Project for Lean Urbanism about 2 years ago on house hacking, because house hacking was one of the ways that coming out of that recession, I really learned how to create some financial resilience for myself and for our family by learning how to use real estate and home ownership as a way and income property as a way to lower my own housing costs. And I hope that's something more people learn. The last thing is just, and I'm sure more people will talk about this, when you have hard times, when we had the recession, it's amazing how much innovation comes out of that. And there is a raft of incredible innovation that came out of the last recession, everything from tactical and lean urbanism to the whole strong towns movement and the small developer movement, all of which were born out of difficult situations. So even if things do get bleaker, as I expect they will, at least in the short term, keep forging ahead and find a way to stay positive and focused on, how can you make a difference in your own community in maybe some atypical ways. I think I'll stop right there, and we can chat more about this as we go on. And I'm happy to turn it over to Mr. Frank Starkey right now. Frank?
Thanks, Kevin. I'd say my biggest lesson was that I was going to learn a lot of lessons when the bottom dropped out of the market and everything came to a screeching halt. The hammers fell silent in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 12. It was a slow motion occurrence, and this seems very slow motion. 9/11 was very fast. It was an instantaneous thing. I mean, it took place over the course of a couple hours, but this is taking place over months, so it feels very different. But I was trying to encourage my niece, who's a sophomore in college, the other day that all these times that we've thought it was the end of the world, it wasn't the end of the world. The Gulf War wasn't the end of the world. 9/11 wasn't the end of the world. The Great Recession wasn't the end of the world. And this won't be either. And I share Kevin's optimism about the human spirit. So going back to 2008, a traditional neighborhood development called Longleaf on a corner of our family's ranch land in Florida, 500 acres. And we had developed 2 of the 4 neighborhoods, and in a move that made us look like geniuses years later, we had sold the 3rd and 4th neighborhoods to another developer. So we were fortunate not to be holding that bag when the music stopped. So we didn't get wiped out like we probably would have been had we been in the middle of a development phase at that time. At the same time, we had begun entitling and planning for the remainder of the ranch development, a 2,500 acre traditional neighborhood development that we were calling Starkey Ranch at the time, and it's still called that, although it hasn't taken the form that we were planning. We got the entitlements for that done in November of 2007. We didn't have the zoning in place though, and that ended up being a whole other story for another webinar. But when everything fell to pieces, the main thing that we still had in Longleaf was the downtown piece. We had a 3-story mixed-use building that comprised a quarter of that 1 quadrant of the downtown. The rest of it was still just grass. And the building had all of the apartments leased up, but none of the retail. In order to get the retail opened up, we decided to open up a coffee shop. We thought that would be easy and low cost and get the building leased up. It did get the building leased up, but I also found myself owning and operating a coffee shop and having to go in to open it up in the morning and be a barista, things that I'm completely not cut out to do. It turned out that was fantastic experience for the rest of my life. So it was, when it came, when it has come time to lease to retailers, I know what it's, I have a much better understanding of what it was to be in their shoes. So having been forced to get outside of my core competencies, I'm an architect, I'm an urbanist, I'm a developer. Well, suddenly I'm a coffee shop owner and having to do things like control inventory and learn a point of sale software system. All of those things were invaluable at some point in the future. So take advantage of the opportunities that you are forced into to do something that you're not used to doing, because there's always something you can apply that to in the future. And the future is going to come. The also in trying to finish out the downtown of Longleaf, tactical urbanism was coming into focus then, and incremental development projects or approach. So I put that into place in the development of downtown Longleaf. And that was an important change in my thinking as well. The remainder of the ranch, as the smoke started to clear and we were coming out of the recession, the only players in the development game at that scale, and really at any scale, were capital B, big capital, and big home builders. The developers, the big master plan community developers had really been, they were still on their heels if they hadn't been completely not wiped out. And the small home builders, regional home builders and custom home builders had been just wiped out. They just were not at all a player in the market. So everything was, all of the shots were being called by national home builders. And because of the shock of the economy, they had retrenched, whereas they had started to dip their toe into the water of doing traditional neighborhood development earlier. They said, they came out of the recession saying T&D is a 4-letter word. We don't want anything remotely that smells of T&D. We want to go back to putting boxes on squares of land and selling them. So that was disillusioning, but also meant that we had to rethink the ranch plan and really strip it back to its basics. So it forced me to say, okay, if we want this to be developed in an urban fashion, what's the least we can, what's the smallest amount that we can sneak into the entitlements and sneak into the, or not sneak, I mean, we weren't underhanded about it, but what are the most important things that we get right so that it has a chance of becoming an urban place at some point in the future. And that was a useful exercise in really stripping down. It's not as much about the column to beam details as it is, and the proportions of the windows, as it is about the platting of the streets and the platting of the lots. So that was an important exercise to have gone through to really understand the core. Meanwhile, back at Longleaf, the core principles of urbanism that needed to be put into the plan. Meanwhile, back at Longleaf, I was really facing the core principles of how do you make a town center, a neighborhood center, a downtown that is vibrant and viable. So also about that time, I saw the talk by Simon Sinek called Starting with Why, and that was the moment that I was able to go back and just rethink all of that. Also, there was a National Town Builders Association had a roundtable in Miami, and James Doherty from Dover Coal spoke, and he made an analogy that during the Dark Ages, the monasteries had become the repository for all of the education and knowledge and information of the previous civilization, and that the intellectual life was concentrated in monasteries. His analogy was that similarly, a lot of the planners who worked for great urbanist planning firms in the glory days of the 2000s had gone to work for municipalities and city governments and regional planning councils and organizations like that. And were not only keeping the flame alive, but they were also putting some plans in place that would make these places, these traditional towns, a lot of which had really good urban bones already, ready for development on an urban fashion. So coming out of the Depression, I decided to focus on small towns with good bones and leadership that got it, and maybe even some plans that were in place. And that's where I restarted my development as my development world as people places. I basically threw up my hands at the prospect of reforming the suburban sprawl development machine, at least for this time, and decided that if we were going to make walkable urban places attractive, that let's start with making the ones that already exist really kick it. And so that's where I ended up being. I'll leave with this. When I was trying to figure out what to do with myself as the world was falling apart, I thought, well, I could go back into architecture, but that's gone. There was no work in architecture. There was no work in any other design fields. I considered going into building. Well, that was a joke. So I really kind of, I had to confront that my entire sector of everything that I might find interesting was gone. And the only one, the last thing that was left possibly was academia. So I called up Chuck Bowl at the University of Miami's Master's in Real Estate Development and Urbanism program and said, Chuck, have you got any teaching jobs? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, we're just starting a developer in residence program, and we'd love to have you try that out. So I served as a developer in residence at Miami for a semester in 2010. And I wasn't responsible for anybody actually learning. I just went and gave a series of lectures, but putting together those lectures, which are still available on Vimeo, was my opportunity to download and debrief what I had learned and experienced and thought up to that point in my career. That was very clarifying. So while there's a lot of downtime in these big transition phases, it's worth taking whatever opportunity you have. And if it's something like giving this talk, which was useful to me just to put my thoughts in order about how I went through this last time, which is always clearer in retrospect than it is going. My encouragement would be to take advantage of the time to think about things ideas that you know are right, and take those into where you go forward. And whatever you find yourself having to do vocationally, just to keep the lights on, understand that is going to be valuable to you in some way, somewhere down the line. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary now and let you take it away. Sorry I went so long.
No problem. Thanks, Frank. Good afternoon from the East Coast. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to stick to what I'd planned to say and not riff off of things that Kevin and Frank have already mentioned, because I'm like, oh, that's a good topic. I want to talk, highlight a couple of different things that I learned. One, probably we all know this, but what I'm going to assume we're all going to see moving forward is there are going to be a lot of things that are completely beyond our control. Not just our physical health with the virus and everything, but just circumstances are going to move forward. And I want to encourage people. I don't know if any of you are movie buffs. There's a line from the movie Bridge of Spies. The Russian spy continually says, whenever someone asks him, aren't you worried about this? His response is always, would it help? And that's something that I've learned. There's always a temptation to fret and worry about all these different things. And I would encourage you all to sort of think about the things that you actually can make a difference in, and not all the other things going on in the world that, are way beyond our control. I'm going to talk a little bit about professional, and then I'm maybe going to go a little more on the personal side even though Frank and Kevin were very personal, mine's going to be more familial, personal. One thing that our firm went from being a 3-person firm to a 2-person firm. So unlike Kevin, we didn't have to completely shut down. We had to sort of rethink what we were going to do. So all of us new urbanists are generalists. We feel like we know a lot about a little, or a little about a lot. One of the things that Jeff Farrell and I learned is, you know, sometimes small is beautiful. We were small enough that we didn't have to worry about major overhead. We didn't have to make payroll with a whole lot of different people. We had the ability to sort of tighten our own personal belts and kind of hunker down and make it through. My husband interjects, tell people they should marry well, because that can also help you in the scheme of things. But I think Kevin and Frank both said, moving forward, if you're small, you may have opportunities come along that without bigger issues to take care of, you may need to jump at opportunities that otherwise, if you had a full workload, you might not have ever taken. Another thing I think all of us new urbanists do a lot is, yes, we're competitors, but we are collegial competitors. One of the things that we really stepped up and started doing again as the recession dragged on forever and ever, and sort of gradually, I think we barely got out of it, I feel like, before we got to today. We really went back to teaming a lot. You know, a lot of new urban firms, we don't all try to do everything in-house. We all are sort of specialized, and I think that will help us moving forward. The idea that, yes, we're generalists, we know a lot, but, you know, Jeff and I did urban designs, but we did a lot of code work. Our code work grew, our urban design went down, but we frequently found ourselves more teaming with other designers and other transportation people. And I would envision that's going to happen a lot again as we move forward. We're going to work together on projects, you know, even if they're few and far between. I want to talk a little bit, shift gears completely now and talk a little bit more on the personal side. I think Kevin said all of us tend to be mission driven. We love urbanism. We love making a difference where we live. We love making a difference in our client communities. A lot of us tend to be workaholics, perhaps more than we would admit. We go on 10-day charrettes. We kind of put our heads down. We work crazy hours like we learned to do in architecture studio. One of the things that happened for me, and I'll mention with Jeff also, in the last recession, actually as we were coming out of it, Jeff and I both lost our moms. And I would say, I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but one of the things that I realized during that period was, because we were slow, it made me sort of rethink my personal priorities. Jeff and I were both able to take time off because business was very slow and go spend time with our moms. We were able to go take care of family business that if we had been working 60 or 80 hours a week, we would probably said, oh, I can't really do that right now. You know, I have to work, I have to get this done. My mom became catastrophically ill for about 6 months before she passed away. I was able to actually go see her 6 or 8 times during that period, that if we had been busy, making that decision would have been much harder, and I probably would have had regrets, and I wouldn't have seen her maybe, you know, 1 time as opposed to the times I did. And I would just encourage anybody, as the time slows down, catch your breath, take a chance, you know, take the time to figure out what's important. Do I really need to work, you know, every weekend, every night, etc.? One of the big things I did moving forward is really now, if I go on charrette, yes, I work on the weekends, but now the weekends are my time. I don't let it sort of, I don't do work emails on the weekends. You know, I try to say, okay, there's work, my mission, I love it, but personal time, family time is really important. And, you know, moving forward, if things are slow, I would encourage all of you, figure out the time, you know, maybe it'll be, once the kids' athletics get started again, you know, maybe it'll make sure you have time to go to your kid's soccer game or whatever that might be. But take the time as things slow down, catch your breath, think about what are my priorities? How will I get the cliche we hear now is the work-life balance. But I just would encourage everyone to keep that in mind. It's really, really important. And when there are times of high stress, having that personal life is one of the best stress reliefs that you can get. So that's maybe not what you're expecting to hear today, but I feel like it was worthwhile for me in middle age to sort of wake up and learn that. I'm going to sort of wrap up, I guess, and hand the microphone to Joe.
Thanks, Mary. Am I on? You know, a lot of this is, I'm maybe to contextualize it at a bigger picture, what's going on from a client standpoint, and what we see with cities reacting toward this COVID experience. To be honest with you, a lot of what we've heard so far, and I'm going to repeat some of this, is this experience of the past recession. Sorry. And back to 2010, this is a slide that I showed at the CNU back then, which is the music stopped. It's laid bare the economic collapse of cities and governments. This was actually a headline back in the day of what was going on in California. My lesson from the CNU was essentially, I was working in real estate development similar to Frank, and basically the bottom just dropped out. And looking at cities the way that real estate developers look at buildings, we were basically asking questions. And I showed up at the CNU and I met this guy, Chuck Marone, and we were on this economics panel. And I was basically pointing at the audience saying, you know, you need to do the math, that people need to understand this stuff. And basically the CNU took that hand and like stuck it on my forehead, where basically I became this business of doing this kind of stuff. It wasn't intentional. I didn't lay awake when I was 9 years old saying someday I'm going to be an economic analyst. It just sort of happened. But these opportunities are all around. You know, I'm not going to argue that I'm going to predict the future in all of this. Oftentimes what we can see is if you just look at what's there, you can see what's happening in the community. What's birthed out of that process were simple analyses like this. This is Eugene, Oregon doing the revenue, but then doing the revenue and the cost to see what's net positive and what's net negative, and showing the city how much they're bleeding their wealth. Taking this model and looking at the bottom, you can see where they're draining their wealth all over the place. This is going to be a problem going forward, whether we like it or not. There are subsidies baked into the system to spread that expense in and across the city, and it comes down to building types. This product wouldn't have happened if it had not been for Chuck, also Nathan Norris, and Will Dowdy was in Eugene doing this. So there are plenty of people still asking questions and digging in. We actually have this Brady Bunch slide of different building types, low density, medium density, high density across the top for residential, low density, medium density, high density, mixed use, and commercial. And these are the sticker prices. So at the end of the day, going forward, all of these things that we know as urbanists are still true and relevant. The suburban pattern is massively subsidized. So how is the consumer going to behave? The market's still going to want that because of the subsidy. And when you spread it across 80% of the land area, that's a recipe for failure. Every community is still going to have that problem. So as revenues stop coming in, because they're going to have those same problems that businesses have, a lack of retail tax or property tax is going to drop, or businesses are going to close. Cities are going to still see that financial effect, and they need to balance their budget. There are lessons for going forward of growing your wealth locally. So as a business, we need to understand our revenues. I had to set up a reserve account in my business in order to maintain through a period that we're about to go through. Again, learning the lesson that Kevin learned as well, is how do you do this? So cities have to look at their financial audit and see what's going on. There's actually some new urbanism up here. So build up the downtown, that works. But you can see Crescent Village, why not do 4 more of these? You know, just find some way to grow your wealth and cultivate it. Our clients need that. They're in the same position we are at a much more macro level at a city and town relationship. The lesson that we learned from Eugene is they actually have maps to target that investment specifically. So much in the way that we need to look at our businesses and adapt, cities do too. And there's a great lesson from Eugene about being financially intentional. And it's cities, businesses, we all need to be more fiscally resilient. Just to put a point on it, this is a chart we make for every community we go into. And at a local level, a city and a county level, you see that if you're in Connecticut or Maine, you're living more off property taxes. If you're over in Arkansas or Louisiana, you're living more off retail taxes. Those communities that live off retail taxes are going to feel the pain first. This is actually a chart that I made in the last recession showing what happens when you lose your job. So as the recession hit, a lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of people are out of work. So immediately you feel the pain of retail sales. There's a direct correlation between you losing your job and the money that you spend, obviously. Property taxes are gonna lag. So those communities that have property tax dependency, they're not gonna feel the pain immediately. But going forward, that's a better, more stable base. So, you know, those communities that are in green, it's gonna be painful up front. This is a chart from a community's budget in Oklahoma, and you can see 76% of their revenue comes off retail sales. That's not good. So communities need to understand that as that money goes, we need to understand how to pay for our communities. There's some great charts out there on taxfoundation.org. This is a chart of, like, as Kevin talked about from a business standpoint, governments need to have reserve accounts as well. And you see that Kansas has no reserve account, basically. It's not good for them. There are states that run off retail taxes. Again, they're going to get hit hard first. So those 4 states that I've highlighted are going to be in the most pain at a state level, and that's going to trickle down to their communities. New York, Louisiana, Nevada, Hawaii, those communities are going to feel the pain. So there's a lot of signals in all of this noise that's going on. There's a lot of personal problems that we all have to deal with, professional problems, but also community problems. And there's economic analysis that's out there. This is one of my favorites. I love that it's cheerfully, depressions never last forever. This is from 1931, and here they are trying to figure out their future. It's an incredible chart that spans from 1854 to 1931, but you see that sine curve again of the collapses, booms, and bust cycles, and some of them hurt more than others. But this is just 30 years zooming in. But let me just, one of the reasons why I pulled this up is to show the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish flu. And you see the depression that followed for about 1.5 years after that. For me, that's an interesting story. That's an interesting lesson. You could look back in time and learn from this. But what I love is you know, depressions never last forever. And here they are walking into the depression, the Great Depression, and hoping that it'll just, you know, maybe a couple of years it'll be over, but it ended up lagging on for another 9 years. So the question to ask is that we look forward in all of this data. Can we really predict what's going to happen next? So tomorrow is just going to be a guess, but I can tell you right now that Indianapolis has way too much roads. They have enough roads to go from Indianapolis to Anchorage, Alaska. That's a lot of cost for a community. I can tell you that new urbanism is productive. This is Lou Oliver's project in Fayetteville, Georgia, super productive. So it produces wealth. I can tell you for a fact that equity is going to be an issue going forward. We're learning about this as a health crisis standpoint. We've learned about this in Kansas City from a redlining perspective. 80 years ago, redlining was put in place. It's still a problem today. So for me, you never let a good crisis go to waste. This is an incredible opportunity to empower our communities with tools and bring them evidence and data to move forward. You know, we stopped letting blood to get rid of humors as a form of solving pandemics. We've used science and data going forward. These maps drive data for us. So we do the map, and that's what we would recommend going forward. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Lynn. So thanks for letting me show a bunch of graphics, and I'll unshare my monitor.
Thanks, Joe. Can you hear me now? Sorry. And thanks, everyone. I thought that was exactly on point. Joe, we got a lot of questions on the chat. Will you be willing to share your slides after this? We can post it on our website, as
Sure.
well as the recording for this webinar will be posted within 24 hours. We've got some questions in, but I wanna first take a moderator's prerogative and ask you all a question. Joe, you have said, here's what we can do for cities. Mary, you work a lot in cities. Victor Dover was on a few weeks ago, and he said, when you have downturns, now's the time to really work in cities. So I'm hearing the same kind of message from multiple new urbanists. But at the same time, we're also hearing, as we launched the virtual Congress, where there's no travel, that so many local governments can't participate. Their budgets are locked down. They're looking at huge deficits this year, not only because of, Joe, what you talk about, the real estate versus property tax, but also because so many local governments are spending resources towards helping with the public health crisis, you know, testing sites, blowing through budgets, and then creating social safety nets for those most vulnerable populations. So nobody has a magic 8-ball, but what type of thinking, what type of advice might you give, or what are you thinking in your own businesses about going forward, working with local governments in these incredibly constrained financial times?
Well, I mean, I'll go first. One of the lessons that I learned in Canada, in Guelph, Ontario, I had made threw a comment into the talk about a lot of cities we work with don't have reserve accounts. Like Kevin talked about at a business level, we run into cities that don't have reserve accounts, and it's kind of mind blowing, or they don't have a reserve account for maintenance of roads and pipes and things like that. And we have all heard Chuck talk about this in Strong Towns. And it was really interesting to hear the response from that community, that the finance officer said, oh, no, we have enough reserve account to cover all future replacement of all of our infrastructure. And we also have a growth fund. And my head exploded that it seemed so obvious to her that if the community was going to grow, we need to reserve money to go forward. Anybody that has a child in school knows that they need to reserve money to pay for a college fund. I mean, there's growth in the family the same way there's growth in the communities. And you know, I think that this is a good opportunity for communities to point at that and say, we need to look at the evidence. It's not about what we think we want. It's about what we can afford going forward. Showing that map of the roads in Indianapolis was mind-blowing to the people, yet you could just walk out in Indianapolis and see it on the street. All the roads are cracked, they can't maintain them. And so it seems so obvious, but you have to make it more real for people. And just a little personal note, I'm Italian, I'm in Italy right now. You know, I mentioned this in a lot of my talks, my family's history of heart disease. And when my dad was going in for his 7 bypass heart surgery, you know, we're Italians, we're all like mocking him. We're like, look, you eat like crazy, you don't exercise, look at you. You know, it's like, sometimes you need that experience to have that awareness, like, okay, that genetic issue is in me too, so I have to exercise and eat right. You know, these are opportunities where we either wake up or we continue our drift into the future. But I think that for me, I see the opportunity.
Mary, I know you do so much work with local governments.
Well, and I'm curious, I'm going to tell what I'm seeing going on, and I'm curious what Kevin and Joe and Frank think about this. Right now, what I've seen, and it depends on the state legislation, I found that communities have been designating construction workers as an essential. They've latched on to the idea that they want to keep moving development forward, private sector development. So like we have a client in Iowa right now, and even though they're working virtually, they're still supposed to be processing all the development applications. Here in Pennsylvania, the legislature had to just pass something that the governor signed this week to allow planning commissions to meet virtually, because by law they had to have a physical quorum. And so this is an intermediate step. I think Massachusetts did something similar. I'm not the economist, but that's what I'm seeing around, is the cities, not on the travel side, not on their sales tax side, but they are trying to keep moving forward. And the communities that I'm talking about, this is not for new greenfield development. They're wanting the infill projects here where I live in State College. You know, it's downtown student housing that's all under construction. But they're trying to keep that moving forward. And I don't know if it's because there's enough in the pipeline that's going to keep going. I don't know if I don't know what the long term is for that, but it seems to be that the communities have latched onto that. We need to keep development moving forward.
Yeah, I think, Mary, it just feels like there is such an incredible state of uncertainty about everything, for good reason. Obviously, there's so much just about the virus itself that we don't really know or understand yet. Um, and so there's a bit of I think what you're seeing is a bit of that desire for people to want to kind of keep normal moving along, in the hopes that we'll come out of this sooner rather than later. But what we really just don't know. And I think that desire will continue as long as there's the resources and ability to do it. If the virus, ultimately the virus is going to determine what happens with our economic response. And if it ends up being a much longer protracted situation, then I would imagine a lot of that construction will probably go to sleep for a while. What I'm seeing, certainly at the local level, is what's been interesting is, local governments can adapt pretty quickly in a crisis, and there's been kind of a stripping away of some layers of and ordinances of things that really we're learning maybe just weren't necessary. And so certain things that can really help out local businesses to keep them afloat, any number of things that may have been very politically difficult even 4 months ago, now a lot of local governments are able to do in an effort to just try to keep people in cash flow. My hope would be we can extend that kind of thinking to some of the things that we in New Urbanism have talked about for a long time, the likes of accessory dwelling units and, simple ways that individuals and households can make some money for themselves and stabilize their own incomes and lives. There are still so many communities, including my own, where that is de facto illegal. And so I hope we can kind of take this time period as a way to reevaluate some of those and do it more quickly. Obviously, there's also been a lot of work on open streets in the last month, which is really encouraging. In my own neighborhood, where we don't typically see a whole ton of people out riding a bike, it's a daily occurrence now. We have, families out riding around on bikes, and just, the amount of foot traffic and biking traffic has been great. And I hope that our communities can learn something from that. And as individuals, we learn something about how pleasurable that is, and that when the crisis subsides, that we can sort of keep some of that momentum in place that people really enjoy. That's a bit what I'm seeing at the local level. I think, one thing I'd be curious about Frank's impact, from the development side. I think the biggest thing that worries me, the biggest concern, is the impact on the commercial real estate market, because I do think we're going to lose a terrible amount of small businesses over the coming year. And the impact of that, I think, will first be felt on the leasing market for commercial real estate. And then that will have a downstream impact on residential as well, very likely. But it's completely a guess. There's so much we don't know. We have no idea.
And
My guess to respond to that directly, Kevin, I have a drastic fear about what's going to happen to the overall retail world. But one of the encouraging things that happened, and this kind of touches on one of the questions about the knee-jerk reaction against density. During the Great Recession, the markets contracted, and we especially saw this in Florida, where you had all these zombie subdivisions that had been built in the middle of freaking nowhere in the go-go days. The markets contracted geographically as well as financially. So the core cities had a dip and then came back first and were the strongest. My hope, and it's always tempered with the reality of things don't ever go the way that we wish that they would. For example, during the Great Recession, we thought, well, this is going to make the benefits of new urbanism self-evident. Well, that's not how the market reacted to it at all. They said, screw new urbanism, we're going back to sprawl, and we're hitting the gas pedal on it. My hope is that as retailers are, as retail contracts, economically, it will also contract geographically, and that downtowns and places where retailers can rely on each other, proximity will find that that's a better place to be. But there could be some development in the world of big capital that changes that significantly. Also, I think we're all worried about the knee-jerk reaction against density overall, because New York, which has insane density that very few other places in the world, in the country, can even imagine getting close to, because New York is so hard hit that we're always worried that density is going to be the scapegoat for everything. Lori Volk had a really good response to that. That after 9/11, we all thought that nobody would ever build a skyscraper again, and that's turned out not to be the case.
Can I add to that?
I think Mary was trying to jump in before. Frank.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, this was because Kevin mentioned it as terms of retail, and a friend of mine who's on the financial side of life, on the investment side, not a new urbanist at all, he mentioned to me last week that he's hearing already, so this is for the rest of you, that not so much about the retail, which we all can witness, but people with large office spaces. He said he has investor clients, one he mentioned in Dallas, who has 80,000 square feet of office, who now has everyone working virtually. And he said, wow, I'm wasting money on all this office space. I could easily go to a rotating schedule. I probably need about 10,000 square feet of office and just let all that go. So I hadn't even thought in those terms that this may also have a really big impact. Yeah, people are not going to do away with all their office, but they may, really cut back on how much they need if they've successfully been able to move forward with people working virtually.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add to this, both pick up off Frank and Mary and also Kevin on this. We saw changes in the recession. We pulled the numbers in Lancaster, California, and they thought they had come back in retail sales from pre to post recession. And it turned out when you adjust for inflation, they were still $2 million in the hole in retail growth. So you wondered, well, what happened? Well, a lot of that retail shifted. A lot of people started buying things online. They started making different purchases rather than the boxes that were in the community. However, the market produced 2 million more square feet of retail environment, totally unnecessary. So they actually literally had a Walmart right across the street from an empty Walmart, which is unbelievably insane. But inside the business model of Walmart, it made sense to do that. But the communities are stuck holding the bill of that empty box now, that cost of that road and whatever. We're going to see a lot of changes in the retail environment that we can't predict, shifts in whether or not we all go out to restaurants anymore, the way that we used to. There's lots of things that are changing. I chose this postcard behind me of Campo dei Fiori in Rome. And when I was in architecture school, I lived, right up over here. And this was still going on. That market was still going on. It's been going on for, thousands of years. The environment of the city has changed and adapted over and over and over again. And the urbanism has allowed that adaptability to happen. So there wasn't like a really shishi wine bar over here 500 years ago, but now there is. But the buildings allowed that adaptability. So I think we're going to see a lot of transitions. Kennedy Smith talks about this at the CNU, the adaptability of those buildings to handle a shoemaker or whatever. It might not be retail or restaurants anymore. So we're going to see a lot of change.
I think that's right. I think we're also going to start seeing acceleration of trends. I've noticed over the last 5 or 6 years, a real shift to localism, almost hyper-localism. And I see that is just going to be accelerating post-recession. Joe, and actually this is for everyone, but did the places where Joe finds your most urban fiscal success prove their economic resilience during the Great Recession? And how do you think they'll fare in the next recession? So I think you started your work right around during the recession, so you might not have that data, but how, for those who have really invested in you know, the strong downtown, strong suburbs that have a lot of the characteristics, how do you think that they're going to fare moving forward in this next recession? And that can actually be a question for all of you.
Well, I'll use Eugene as an example. Eugene has a growth boundary, and they held to it through the recession and after. But then they started considering expanding their growth boundary. Well, that's one of the reasons why they wanted to do the measurements, was to understand whether or not they were financially, fiscally solid enough to do that expansion. Unlike the Canadians have a growth fund, the Guelph, City of Guelph, and they also have a growth boundary. So I think that in Guelph's case, coming out of the recession, they were looking at ways of doing downtown investment and growing up that downtown core by targeting growth there before you expand the boundary. Eugene's basically doing the same thing. So I don't have enough data to say pre-recession how people were doing things. And also we generally don't hold people accountable to that, because there's a lot of politics that change over a 10-year period. And what might not have been politically palatable 10 years ago is more politically palatable now. And that's a point that Kevin brought out, that when you mention the cities, like, you might want to get rid of your parking requirements in your core areas. To say that 5 years ago in Indianapolis might have been heretical, but today it's like, oh yeah, we could do that. You know, so we're going to see a lot of change. So maybe some policy recommendation didn't work before, but maybe it works now. There's a lot of moving parts with cities.
And I think, you know, Joe, and to the others' points as well, we have to consider that the reaction is going to be different in very different parts of the country, because the impact of this pandemic is so different. You know, to your point about New York City, you know, earlier, I would imagine in the greater New York region, there's going to be PTSD about this for quite a long period of time. And who knows how that affects people's view of urbanism or life in New York City. You're absolutely right that after 9/11, you know, that it came roaring back and even accelerated New York's ascent in many ways. But we don't know for sure. This is a different animal, and it's like, I think people are likely to come back, and New York is likely to carry on, but we just don't know for sure. In other parts of the country where there hasn't been a whole lot of impact, it may just be business as usual, you know, and there's an incredible urge to try to get back to normal, whatever normal is. And so I think, as we saw coming out of the Great Recession, there's certainly going to be a push on the parts of some to kind of get the suburban development machine, you know, up and running as quickly as possible, again, unfortunately.
Well, I think too, and I'm going to call on Joe again, I think too there's an issue of data. When we first saw data around climate emissions, it looked as though cities were hotspots. When you look at stormwater runoff, it looks as though cities are hotspots. When you look at the amount of deaths or cases, it looks like cities are hotspots. But that's not an apples to apples comparison. When you look at things on a more per capita basis, you're actually finding that the death rates and the infection rates are higher in the suburban areas. And Joe, I think we want to have a separate webinar around this data, but Joe, I think that you've started diving into this a little bit that demonstrates this point. I know it's not ready to go yet, but.
Yeah, I'm actually pulling it up. I mean, this is one of the things that's really bothered me about the conversation, is that you read all of these headlines about New York City and it's pretty scary. And we started getting feedback from people of, oh, well, you know, this is the reason why not to have density, blah, blah, blah. New York Times did an article. Sorry, I'm just pulling up the data. I have to have data. And they finally started breaking the cases down on a per capita basis. And New York was coming in at about what Peekskill, Massachusetts on a per capita basis. And why can't I find it? Sorry, you caught me off guard.
So sorry. But again, the Center for Neighborhood Technology has done some amazing work. I'm looking at air emissions and climate on a per capita basis. The EPA has done the same on stormwater. You can look at, VMT, any type of measure, it looks as though cities are hot spots, but when you normalize it out on a per capita basis, you actually find almost the inverse is true. So, Mark Fenton and others have asked this question, like, what is our script? And many people, such as Emily Badger, Allison Arif from Spur, Lori Volk, others have said cities have always been part of the solution. Hard stop. Boom. And there may very well be some issues created by cities, but when you look at the alternative, there are so many more problems economically, environmentally, sustainability, public health across the board that result from a more low density dispersed development pattern. I don't think that this is going to diminish the attraction of cities at all. I think in just exactly what Kevin is saying, I think we're going to see innovations of how we begin to interact, how public space is reimagined. All of us are redefining our relationship to the built and natural environment, and this is the opportunity we should be seizing on. Joe, I was trying to give you some time.
Yeah, I found it. New York City's pulling the same COVID cases as Pittsfield, Massachusetts on a per capita, per square area, per square mile basis. So that's what we don't see in any of the data yet is no one's bothered to grab the area. So they're making an assumption about density just on a per capita basis and not necessarily on an area basis. So density is all about your people per area. East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, and Bridgeport, Connecticut have higher incidences of COVID cases per capita per square mile. Now, the one caveat to this study is it's such a moving target because we don't have consistent testing. Not everybody has access to public health the way that people do in New York City. But on a GDP basis, New York City is twice the GDP of those other places that I mentioned. So as Glazer writes in Triumph of the City, we move to cities for that economic opportunity. They produce more wealth for us and other things of health, and they're better for the environment. There's all of these great things that we just have to do the math on to show. But I'll talk with Rob about getting this information to him.
That would be fantastic. I want to ask all the panelists one final question, which is a little bit less about lessons from the last recession, but it's riffing off of what Kevin said at the very beginning, that this is a period of time for great innovation. And we have already seen how some cities are turning their streets over to be pedestrian only. We're going to reimagine, I think, how restaurants are run, etc. In your magic 8 ball of all of your years in being urbanists, what is the one trend that you hope to see come out of this in terms of reimagining our public realm or cities?
6-foot sidewalks. I see a lot more excitement and appreciation for public space. I see people appreciating public space in a way they never have before. I think that's going to be a good thing. I got really excited by what Mary was just describing about large office plates, employment centers kind of going to reducing. That means a lot more business, a lot more enterprises can be concentrated in those spaces, but also it could in the short to middle term mean that if people are working only having to commute into the office part of the week and not every day, that could have very salubrious effects on our neighborhood, on the demands that our neighborhoods be livable and walkable and enjoyable on a daily basis, because people will be spending their full days there more of the time and not locked inside. And also it could have some great impacts on our transportation, on our peak hour transportation things. But so that could be kind of exciting as a shift. I don't see it as being revolutions are always overrated. They don't seem to happen, but incremental changes can be pretty cool.
I was going to say what Frank just said is based on my own personal anecdotal looking out my front window. Incredible numbers of people on their bikes and families going for walks as families in the neighborhood, etc. I'm hoping that they realize, wow, we can walk to all these things that we didn't realize we could before. I'm trying not to let the pessimists sneak in and say there's going to be a huge boomerang when everybody jumps into their car and just starts driving all over creation again. But there are way more people with kids in my neighborhood than I even realized. Now I'm seeing them, walking up and down the street and walking their dogs and all of that. And it's actually makes me feel like my neighborhood is more lively than I realized.
I would love to hope this begins to pierce the bubble that our cities need to be designed around the Monday through Friday commute. I think there probably will be a substantial change in the telecommuting and a shift in how people work as a result of this, because it's forced it upon us. Obviously, we're not all going to be working from home, and people like to work with each other in offices or shops. But it will cause a shift in some regard, and it has a huge impact on the notion that city streets should be designed around the morning and evening commute. And that would be one of the best possible outcomes we could have to really reallocate space in the public right-of-way away from rush hour traffic.
I'd just like to add to this that I agree with all of the comments. I do think that having, basically, I want to just throw this for Mary. She mentioned a movie. For me, it's starting to feel a little bit like Groundhog Day. It's like every day I'm in the same place and it's the same thing. And I sort of need that office environment to get out of this space and to get into a new intellectual space. I thrive on working with people. So for me, there's a need to be in that office environment because of the intellectual gain that we all get in working together. We pick up some of that in webinars and stuff, but it's a different environment. So I think that a lot of folks don't have the benefit of having what I have. I have a 1,200 square feet to myself. There are people that have families and family space and they need that break to get out. So I don't think it's just a one size fits all change of what's going to happen in the environment. I think that more people are learning that they can actually work apart, and that will change. But I don't think that the industries are going to change that dramatically.
Well, I want to thank you all for participating. Kevin, Frank, Mary, Joe, you guys have been longtime supporters of New Urbanism, incredible leaders for the movement, for the organization, and I just really want to thank you for all your contributions. I want to thank all the viewers for being here, and to remind folks that we just launched registration for the virtual CNU 28. So come and experience the Twin Cities and the Congress as never before through Zoom. And then finally, next week, we're going to hear how this is impacting local government. We're going to be hearing Julie Mayfield from Asheville, certainly Carrie Hayes from Chattanooga, Dan Bisden from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Jacob Lindsay from, I missed it, a town in California. So let's hear directly from local governments on how they're experiencing all of this. So with that, thank you again. Again, this will be recorded. All of the recording will be on our website within 24 hours, as well as Joe's slides. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. And I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.